The thorns were the first priests to officiate her union, tearing at the fine lace of her wedding dress with a vicious sacrament. They ripped through the delicate fabric, exposing the bruised flesh beneath a tapestry of purple and blue blooming across her skin before she ever reached an altar. The prairie night was a cold, indifferent witness. Her bare feet, shredded and bleeding, registered the sharp protest of every stone and burr on the unforgiving ground. She ran fueled by a terror so profound it had become a physical entity, a monstrous thing clawing at her back. In her tightly clenched fist, she held a small silver locket, its cool metal a stark contrast to the feverish heat of her skin. It was the last gift from her mother, a fragile heirloom containing two tiny faded portraits. One of a woman with kind eyes, and the other an empty space waiting for a future that had just been stolen from her. The locket was more than silver and glass. It was a testament to a life she was supposed to have, a life of choice and love, now a distant dream chased by the thunder of hoofbeats behind her. The sounds grew closer, a rhythmic drumming that echoed the frantic beat of her own heart, punctuated by the muffled shouts of men whose voices she had learned to fear in the space of a single horrifying afternoon. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded her senses. Brief fractured images flashed behind her eyes, the kindling of her nightmare. Her father, Abel Whitlow, his face pale and haggard, the crutch he leaned on a constant reminder of the busted leg and the busted luck that had crippled their lives. His hand trembled as he signed the paper, the scratch of the nib a death sentence. Silas Pike's smile. It was not a smile of warmth, but of acquisition, the cold, satisfied expression of a man surveying a new possession. He'd looked at her not as a bride, but as the final, most valuable chip in a game her father had long since lost. A debt is a promise etched in stone. Silas had said, his voice a silken threat. Your father simply chose the stone upon which it would be carved. The chilling realization in the starkly furnished room where they'd left her to prepare. The wedding dress was not a symbol of hope, but a shroud. The marriage was not a union, but a cage, and Silas Pike held the only key. The memory spurred her onward. She burst through a thicket of mesquite, the branches whipping at her face and arms, leaving fresh red lines on her skin. Ahead, a faint straight line broke the chaotic wilderness of the plains, a fence. And beyond it, a gate. A lonely ranch, a flicker of impossible hope in the vast, swallowing darkness. With the last of her strength, she scrambled over a barbed wire fence, the metal tearing a fresh gash in her hip. She barely felt it. She stumbled toward the wooden gate, her lungs burning, her vision swimming in a sea of black spots. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, a simple mechanism that felt as complex as a bank vault. It gave way with a groan of protest. She fell through the opening, collapsing onto the dusty ground inside the air, leaving her body in a single, ragged sob. The ranch was silent, a sleeping giant under a blanket of stars. She lay there, a broken doll in a ruined dress, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her. Had they given up, or were they merely circling wolves, waiting for their prey to exhaust itself? The world tilted, the stars blurring into streaks of light. As a shadow fell over her, she saw the silhouette of a man approaching, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. Her hand went limp. The silver locket, her last connection to the girl she used to be, slipped from her grasp and fell into the dust with a soft, final thud. Eli Graves had seen his share of broken things. He'd seen busted wagons, drought-starved cattle, and men whose spirits had been shattered by the merciless indifference of the land. But the woman collapsed at his gate was something else entirely. She looked like a fallen angel dragged through hell and left to die on his doorstep. The moonlight cast her in a ghostly pallor, highlighting the stark contrast between the white of her dress and the dark, ugly bruises that marred her skin. He knelt, moving with a deliberate slowness, that belied the tension coiling in his gut. He was a man who lived by a simple code mind, his own business keep his head down and let the past stay buried. This woman was a complication he could not afford. Yet, as he looked at her trembling form, the sheer desperation radiating from her, he knew he couldn't turn away. That part of him, the man who once stood for something, was not as dead as he'd led himself to believe. His hands, rough and calloused from years of mending fences and breaking horses, were surprisingly gentle as he draped his canvas coat over her shivering shoulders. His gaze fell upon the torn fabric at her hip, where blood stained the lace, a deep, rusty brown. He carefully pulled the material aside to inspect the wound. It was a nasty gash from the barbed wire, but it was something else that made him freeze. Beneath the new wound, circling her waist and disappearing under the dress, were the angry chafed marks of a rawhide rope. And tangled in the lace, almost hidden, was a thin strip of red cloth stitched into the rope's fibers with a distinctive crosshatch pattern. Time seemed to stop. The quiet hum of the prairie faded into a dull roar in his ears. He stared at that small piece of red fabric as if a ghost had risen from the earth and handed him a piece of his own damned soul. He had not seen that knot, that specific marker, in 10 years. Not since the dust and blood and screams of Red Mesa. Clara's one good eye fluttered open. She watched him, her gaze clouded with fear and confusion. He looked calm, too calm, but she saw something shift in the depths of his gray eyes, a flicker of recognition that sent a chill colder than the night air through her. He knew that mark. He knew who had done this to her. The horrifying thought struck her, had she just run from one devil straight into the arms of his kin? Eli finally broke the silence, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed dredged up from a deep, forgotten well. Only one crew ties a rope like that. The words meant nothing to her, but the tone in which he spoke them was laden with a history she could not comprehend. This was no simple rancher. There was a weight to him, a stillness that spoke of storms weathered and battles fought. He carried himself like a man who was intimately familiar with violence, a man whose name might have once inspired fear. And if he was right, if he recognized that mark, then the man she was fleeing was connected to this stranger in a way that tightened the knot of dread in her stomach. Her hands clutched his coat. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She was no longer sure if he was the savior she had prayed for or simply the next chapter in her nightmare. The distant sound returned faint at first, then growing steadily louder. A single rider approaching at a confident clip. The sound of hooves on the hard-packed earth was a death knell. Clara flinched, trying to shrink into the ground to become invisible. Eli rose slowly, a mountain of a man, shielding her from view. His hand rested for a moment on the coat covering her shoulders, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. A young rider pulled his horse to a sharp halt at the gate, the animal snorting and stamping in a cloud of dust. The man's face was arranged in a permanent sneer. He was wiry and mean-eyed, one of the men who had dragged her from the room where she was to be wed. Mace. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. "Stand aside, old man." Mace spat his eyes, fixing on Clara with possessive contempt. "The bride's got a wedding to finish." A tremor ran through Clara, but from some hidden reserve of strength she shook her head, tears tracing new paths through the grime on her cheeks. "I am not going back," she said. Her voice was a cracked whisper, yet it held the unbending certainty of a final decision. Mace leaned forward in his saddle, his knuckles white on the reins. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing Eli's boot. "Mr. Pike ain't asking." He swung a leg over his horse, intent on dragging her back himself. Without a word, Eli shifted his body, a simple movement, that placed him squarely between Mace and Clara. For a heartbeat, the scene was deceptively calm, a rancher defending his property line. But Mace, arrogant and foolish, failed to recognize the man he was facing. He saw only an aging farmer, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. He did not see the coiled readiness in Eli's stance, or the way his eyes, steady and cold as river stones, measured him with lethal precision. "Move!" Mace barked his hand, dropping to the Colt holstered at his hip. "Or I'll move you." He went for his gun. It was a fatal miscalculation. In a surge of desperate defiance, Clara scooped a handful of dust and flung it into Mace's face. He cursed, stumbling back, momentarily blinded. It was all the opening Eli needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion that defied his size. In one fluid sequence, he stepped forward, deflected Mace's draw, and twisted the man's arm at an unnatural angle. The revolver clattered to the ground. A sharp crack echoed in the night as Eli's fist connected with Mace's jaw. The man's eyes rolled back in his head as Eli slammed him face first into the dirt. The thud was sickeningly final. Mace gasped for air, pinned beneath a heavy boot that pressed firmly against the back of his neck. Eli's voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of heat, as cold and final as a gravestone. "Tell Silas Pike to come himself." He lifted his boot. Mace scrambled away like a kicked dog, clutching his throat and spitting dirt. He clawed his way into the saddle, his face a mask of shock and pain. He cast one last terrified look at the silent figure by the gate, then spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, the sound of his retreat swallowed by the immense dark prairie. Clara's hands shook as she clutched the coat. She stared at the rancher, truly stared at him for the first time, and a terrifying and wonderful question bloomed in her mind. This was no ordinary man. The economy of his violence, the chilling authority in his voice, the way he seemed to command the very ground he stood on. Whoever he was, he had just saved her. But in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand, and Silas Pike was not a man who respected boundaries. This fight was only beginning. "Who are you?" She whispered the question, hanging in the air, fragile and essential. Eli Graves didn't answer. He simply stared at the horizon, where a new cloud of dust was already beginning to rise, a storm of his own, making a past he could no longer outrun. The dust cloud on the horizon swelled a gathering storm of men and horses moving with grim purpose. It was not one rider this time, but a pack. At its head rode a figure whose silhouette alone was enough to make Clara's blood run cold. Silas Pike sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his posture ramrod straight. He was dressed in the imported black wool of a city gentleman, a stark, predatory shape against the faded denim of the land. A silver watch chain gleamed on his waistcoat, catching the morning sun with every arrogant gesture. Clara's body went rigid. The breath caught in her throat and his name formed on her lips, without a sound, a silent prayer of damnation. Eli remained at the gate, an unmovable sentinel. The coat he had given her was still draped over her shoulders, a small shield against the coming onslaught. His eyes, narrowed against the sun's glare, were locked on the approaching riders, his expression as impassive as carved granite. As Silas drew near his horse, slowing to a prancing walk, he surveyed the scene with a faint, dismissive smirk. He saw the girl looking more like a feral cat than the pristine bride he'd purchased. He saw the dilapidated ranch, a testament to a failed life. And he saw the old man standing in his way. But as he got close enough to see the man's face clearly, the smirk faltered. The easy confidence in his posture tightened. For the first time in years, Silas Pike looked uncertain. He knew that face. He knew the set of that jaw and the unnerving stillness in those eyes. He knew the way the man held himself, hands loose at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if they were perpetually ready to close around the grip of a gun. The whispers of old stories, the campfire tales that had terrified him as a youth, came flooding back with the force of a flash flood. Eli Graves, the butcher of Red Mesa. The man who had walked away from a bloodbath that had left a dozen men dead, disappearing from the face of the earth, as if he'd been a ghost all along. The same man who on that terrible day had left Silas with a screaming wound, a permanently missing finger on his left hand, and a legacy of nightmares he never spoke of to a living soul. Clara, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, glanced between the two men. She saw the change in Silas, the way his cruel arrogance had been replaced by a pale, haunted stare. The silence stretched thick and heavy with unspoken history. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying with it the ghosts of a violent past. Then Eli spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the dusty yard like a hammer striking an anvil. "The gate is mine." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "The girl says no." Finding a reservoir of courage she didn't know she possessed. Clara straightened her shoulders. Her own voice, though thin, rang with a fierce newfound clarity. "I say no." The words, so simple and direct, seemed to cut through Silas Pike more sharply than any bullet could have. He flinched. His men, arrayed behind him like a pack of nervous hounds, looked to him for an order, their hands hovering over their own weapons. But Silas's hand trembled slightly on the reins of his horse. He remembered all too well the impossible speed of Eli Graves. He remembered the calm, deadly focus in his eyes as men fell around him. One wrong move here, and this dusty patch of land would become another Red Mesa. Half his men wouldn't live to see the sunset. So he did the only thing he could. He forced a laugh, a hollow, brittle sound that failed to mask the tremor of fear in his voice. "This ain't over, Graves," he snarled, trying to salvage a shred of his authority. "I've been waiting a long time to settle the score for my family. This changes nothing." He tugged violently on the reins, wheeling his magnificent horse around. The rest of his pack followed suit, a confused and reluctant retreat, leaving the gate behind in a roiling cloud of ochre dust. Clara sagged against the wooden post, a wave of relief so powerful it left her weak need washing over her. But it was tangled with a profound confusion. Who was this man who could make the fearsome Silas Pike turn tail and run without firing a single shot? What kind of ghosts did he carry that made hardened outlaws bow their heads and retreat? She looked at Eli, who was still watching the departing riders, his expression unchanged. If Silas Pike had walked away today, it was not because he had been defeated. It was because he was regrouping, planning something far worse for tomorrow. And Clara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that tomorrow always comes. The days that followed were a strange, suspended peace. The ranch, which had at first felt like another cage, began to transform in Clara's eyes. It was a sanctuary. Eli kept to his chores with a relentless, methodical rhythm, fixing the fences Silas's men had likely already scouted, tending to his small herd of cattle, and always watching the horizon. He moved like a man who never truly laid down his guard, his silence a living, breathing thing. Clara's bruises began to fade from angry purple to mottled yellow, physical evidence of her healing. The memories, however, still burned brightly in the dark. She would wake in the small, clean room Eli had given her, gasping for air, the phantom touch of Silas's hands on her skin. She would clutch the worn quilt to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. And each time she would see the faint glow of the fire in the main room, where Eli sat in his chair, a silent vigil waiting for her breathing to slow and the terrors to recede. He never spoke of it, never offered empty words of comfort. His comfort was in his presence, a steady, unmovable rock in the turbulent sea of her fear. Living alongside him was like living with a sleeping mountain. He was sparse with his words, his dialogue measured and functional. He spoke when something needed to be said, and not a moment sooner. One evening, as she helped him clean a rifle by the fire, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why did you help me?" Eli didn't look up from his work, his hands moving with practiced ease over the steel and wood. He squinted down the barrel, checking for imperfections. After a long moment, he looked past her toward the dark window pane that reflected the lonely plains outside. "Saw enough cages in my time," he said, and that was all. It was a single sentence, but it carried a world of meaning. By the third morning, Clara felt the strength returning to her limbs. She carried buckets of water from the well, and the simple, honest ache in her muscles, a welcome sensation. She walked the dirt path to the gate, her bare feet growing tough against the packed earth, and for the first time, she did not feel the urge to run. The gate was no longer an escape route. It was a boundary she had chosen. This fragile peace was shattered on the fourth day. A single rider approached, not with the menace of Silas's men, but with a slumped, defeated posture. It was her father, Abel Whitlow. He sat stiffly in the saddle, his face a drawn mask of worry and misplaced anger. He dismounted at the gate, refusing to step onto the property, as if the ground itself were hostile. "Clara," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "You've shamed us. Run off like a common trollop." Eli emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He stood beside Clara, a silent pillar of support. Abel's eyes darted from his daughter to the imposing figure of the rancher. He puffed out his chest, trying to project an authority he had long since forfeited. "You've kept my daughter here against her will. You've ruined her name. If you want this sordid affair to end, you will pay me for my troubles. $500. For her dowry and my silence." Clara's heart, which had just begun to heal, fractured anew. He wasn't here to save her. He was here to sell her all over again. The shame was so intense, it felt like a physical blow. Eli stepped forward, his shadow falling over Abel. His voice was not angry, but it was heavy laden with the weight of a memory Abel had clearly tried to bury. "You still chasing poker debts, Abel?" Eli asked, his tone quiet and dangerously calm. "Ask Silas Pike about Red Mesa. Ask him what happened to the man who set his brother up to die. Ask him who really cleared your debt that night you nearly lost your life." Abel froze, the color draining from his face. The name Red Mesa carried more power than any bullet. His blustering facade crumbled, revealing the terrified, weak man beneath. He remembered that night of blood and chaos. He remembered being cornered, a gun to his head, moments from death. And he remembered a shadowed gunman, a figure of impossible speed and violence, who had stood between him and the grave. He had never known who it was. Until now. He stared at Eli, true understanding dawning in his eyes. The rancher, the savior. It was the same man. And this man knew his secret. He knew about the betrayal. Abel's anger evaporated, replaced by a deep, hollow shame. Without another word, he turned, fumbled his way back onto his horse, and rode away, a man made small by his own cowardice, leaving his daughter behind for good. The silence that returned to the ranch was different this time. It was cleaner, purer. Clara turned to Eli, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Her voice shook not with fear, but with a wondering awe. What do I owe you for this, for everything?" Eli finally looked at her, his expression softening for the first time. He shook his head. "Nothing," he said. From this gate inward, your life is your own. It's your choice. The tears finally fell hot and cleansing. For the first time in her life, she had been given a choice that was truly hers. And standing there, on the dusty soil of a lonely ranch owned by a man with a ghost in his eyes, she chose to stay. Weeks bled into a month. The initial fragile peace at the ranch solidified into a routine, a shared life built on unspoken understanding. Clara learned the rhythms of the land. She woke with the sun, her hands growing calloused, as she learned to mend fences, tend to the small vegetable garden, and brush down Eli's stoic gelding ghost. She discovered a quiet competence within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. Her voice, once timid and broken, found its strength. She began to speak with a firmness that surprised even herself. Eli, in turn, began to emerge from the fortress of solitude he had built around himself. He taught her how to read the tracks of coyotes and deer in the dust, how to predict the weather by the color of the sky. He was a patient teacher, his sparse words supplemented by gestures and a quiet shared focus. They ate their meals together by the fire, often in silence. But it was a comfortable silence filled with the simple communion of two people who had found an unlikely harbor in one another. One evening, while cleaning out a dusty corner of the barn, Clara found an old leather-bound book. The pages were filled with Eli's surprisingly neat handwriting, but it wasn't a ledger or a journal. It was filled with sketches of birds and plants, with detailed notes on their habits and properties. It was the work of a man who paid close attention to the world, a man who saw beauty in the small, quiet things. It was a window into the soul of the man he was before Red Mesa, and the man he still fought to be. But the shadow of Silas Pike was long, and it was creeping closer. The peace was an illusion, a brief inhalation before the plunge. It began subtly. A section of fence cut in the dead of night, allowing a few head of cattle to wander off. A week later, their water well was fouled. The clear water turned murky and foul-smelling. These were not direct attacks, but acts of attrition designed to harass, to weaken, to remind them that they were under siege. Eli grew quieter, more watchful. The haunted look in his eyes sharpened. He spent his nights not by the fire, but on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He was slipping back into the man. He had tried so hard to bury the man, who knew how to anticipate an enemy's move, how to think like a predator. Clara insisted on taking a watch. "I will not be a victim in this," she told him, her voice unwavering. "This is my home now. I'll help you defend it." He looked at her, a flicker of something respect, perhaps even admiration in his eyes. He nodded once and showed her how to load and aim the rifle, his large hands guiding hers with a steady, impersonal touch. The final escalation came with the sheriff. Eli rode into the nearby town of Redemption to report the sabotage, a fool's errand he knew was necessary. He found Sheriff Miller behind his desk, a portly man with tired eyes and a sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the morning cool. Miller listened to Eli's report with a feigned expression of concern, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. "Now, Graves," the sheriff said, his voice oozing a weary bureaucracy. "Are you sure you ain't just having some bad luck? Fences break? Wells go bad. This is hard country." "This ain't luck, Miller." Eli said, his voice flat. "It's Silas Pike." The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Silas Pike is a respected businessman. He owns half the county. A man like that has no reason to trouble himself with a small-time rancher like you. I'll need proof, witnesses." The only witnesses work for him. Eli stated the cold reality of their situation, settling in his gut. "Then I'm afraid my hands are tied," Miller said, his tone final. He wouldn't challenge a man as powerful as Pike. He was either bought or intimidated, and either way, he was useless. Eli left the sheriff's office, the feeling of isolation more profound than ever. They were on their own. As he mounted Ghost to ride back, he saw Silas Pike standing across the street, leaning against a post outside the saloon. Silas met his gaze and offered a slow, deliberate smile. He raised his left hand, the one with the missing finger, and tipped his hat in a gesture of mocking politeness. The message was clear. This town, this law, it all belonged to him. There was nowhere to run. When Eli returned to the ranch, he didn't have to say a word. Clara saw the grim set of his jaw and knew. The illusion of peace was over. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. That evening, as the sun bled across the plains, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and deep purple, Eli made his decision. He wants to wear us down. Eli said, his voice low as they sat on the porch. He wants to see us broken. We're not going to give him the satisfaction. He looked at Clara, his gaze intense. We end this. On our terms. He sent Jed, his grizzled, loyal ranch hand, on a long ride to the next county with a message for a federal marshal he knew from his past, a long shot, but their only one. Then Eli sent his own message to Silas Pike, delivered by a passing merchant. It was a simple offer, a pretense of surrender. He would negotiate Clara's return. The meeting was to take place in his barn at dusk the following day. It was a trap. And as the sky began to darken on the day of the reckoning, the wind began to howl, kicking up dust from the parched earth. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the violence about to be unleashed. The world outside the barn was about to disappear into a maelstrom of swirling dust and screaming wind. The wind was a living beast clawing at the walls of the barn, its mournful howl a fitting overture for the night's events. Dust, fine as flour, seeped through every crack in the old wood, swirling in the dim, flickering light of a single lantern hanging from a central beam. The air was thick and gritty, tasting of earth and fear. Outside, the world had been erased by a raging dust storm, a violent ochre curtain that isolated the ranch from any hope of aid. Inside the barn, the tension was a physical presence. Eli stood near the large open doors, a silhouette against the tumultuous backdrop of the storm. He held a shotgun, its twin barrels gleaming dully in the lantern light. Clara was hidden in the hayloft above a rifle clutched in her hands. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She was no longer the terrified girl who had collapsed at the gate. She was a defender of the only home she had ever chosen. Headlights cut through the swirling dust, not horses, but Silas Pike's new motor car, a monstrous black machine that signaled his modern brand of tyranny. It stopped a short distance from the barn. Silas emerged flanked by Mace and one other hard-faced gunman. They moved toward the barn, their coats flapping wildly in the wind, their faces masked by bandanas to ward off the dust. Silas stepped into the lantern's glow, pulling the bandana from his face. He surveyed the cavernous space with a conqueror's arrogance, his eyes glinting. "Graves?" He called out, his voice smooth and clear despite the storm's roar. "I appreciate you seeing reason. A pragmatic end to an emotional folly. Now where is my bride?" "She's not yours." Eli's voice boomed from the shadows. "Never was." Silas chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, I'm not here for her. Not really. She was just the key, you see. The key to unlock this door to bring you out of hiding." He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Eli's. "My dear Clara, a debt is a promise etched in stone. Your father simply chose the stone upon which it would be carved. And that stone, Graves, was you. The pieces clicked into place in Eli's mind, the cryptic remarks, the personal nature of the vendetta. My brother Thomas Pike died at Red Mesa. Silas said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. A good man. A loyal brother. You put the bullet in him. You, the butcher of Red Mesa. Our family lost everything that day, our name, our fortune. I've spent 10 years clawing my way back, all for this moment. For this night. I don't just want the girl. I want to burn this pathetic sanctuary of yours to the ground and watch you choke on the ashes of the peace you never deserved. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was never about a debt or a bride. It was about revenge. Your brother drew on a man whose back was turned. Eli stated, his voice a low growl of remembered fury. He got what he earned. He was betrayed. Silas shrieked, his composure finally cracking. And you were the butcher who finished the job. He gestured wildly toward the loft where Clara was hidden, though he didn't know she was there. And the best part of my plan, the beautiful poetic justice of it all, the man who betrayed him, was her father. From her hiding place, Clara gasped. The world tilted on its axis. Abel Whitlow. Silas bellowed, savoring the poison of his words. He sold my brother out to you for a handful of silver to clear his own gambling debts. He set the whole thing up, girl. Left Thomas to be slaughtered by the great Eli Graves I've known all along. My plan was always to ruin you both, to take the last thing of value from his pathetic line and use it to destroy the man who pulled the trigger. The second twist landed like a physical blow. Clara stared down into the swirling dust, seeing not a father, but a traitor. Eli's guilt, the ghost of the man he killed, was suddenly complicated, tainted by the knowledge that he had been a pawn in a coward's game. The time for words was over. Silas nodded to his men. Burn it. Mace grinned and pulled a flask from his coat, splashing kerosene onto a pile of hay. As he fumbled for a match, the first shot rang out. Not from Eli's shotgun, but from the rifle in the loft. The bullet slammed into the wall inches from Mace's head, sending splinters flying. He yelped and dropped the matches, scrambling for cover. All hell broke loose. The second gunman opened fire on the loft, and the bullets chewing through the wooden planks around Clara. Eli unleashed a blast from his shotgun, the roar deafening in the enclosed space, sending the gunman staggering back. The barn became a whirlwind of chaos. Dust and shadows danced in the erratic light of the swinging lantern. The howl of the wind outside was matched by the thunder of gunfire within. Silas drew his own ornate pistol, firing wildly at Eli, who used the large support beams for cover. Clara knew she had to do more. She scrambled across the loft, her knowledge of the barn's layout her greatest weapon. Positioned above the main floor, she saw Mace trying to light another match. Acting on pure instinct, she shoved at the pulley rope that held a massive bale of hay suspended for winter feeding. The knot slipped. The bale plummeted downward, crashing to the floor with a tremendous thud, missing Mace by inches, but burying his leg under its immense weight. He screamed in pain and fury. The distraction gave Eli the opening he needed. He burst from behind a pillar not as a rancher, but as the warrior he once was. He moved with a brutal, efficient grace, disarming the remaining gunman with a swift blow from his shotgun stock. He then turned his attention to Silas. The two men met in the center of the barn, a maelstrom of personal hatred. It was no longer a gunfight, but a desperate, violent brawl. Fists flew. A fist connected with bone. Dirt flew. They crashed into stalls, scattering terrified livestock. Silas was younger, but Eli fought with the cold, focused rage of a man defending his soul. He slammed Silas against a wall, his hand closing around Pike's throat. Silas's pistol clattered to the floor. Eli wrenched Silas's arm back, pressing the muzzle of his own revolver under the man's chin. The fight was over. Silas was defeated, gasping for breath, his arrogant face smeared with blood and grime. The barn fell silent, save for the moaning of the wind and the pained cries of Mace still pinned under the hay. "They go on." Silas rasped, a crazed, triumphant light in his eyes. "Do it. Finish it. Become the killer they all remember. Let the butcher of Red Mesa be the last thing you ever are." Eli's finger tightened on the trigger. The ghosts of his past swirled around him, urging him on, whispering that this was the only way to end the cycle of violence. His face was a mask of torment. Then from the loft, Clara's voice cut through the tempest. "Eli, no." He looked up. He saw her face pale and determined in the lantern light. She was not pleading. She was reminding him of the man who sketched birds in a book, the man who sat vigil by the fire, the man who had given her a choice. Killing Silas would not bury his past. It would resurrect it forever. His breath shuddered out of him. The fire in his eyes cooled. With a final disgusted shove, he threw Silas to the ground. The choice was made. He would not be that man again. Not for Silas. Not for anyone. As if on cue, the fury of the dust storm began to subside. The wind's scream softened to a weary moan, and through the dust-choked air, the flashing lights of distant lanterns could be seen approaching. Jed had succeeded. The federal marshal had arrived, guided by the old ranch hand through the dying storm. Silas Pike, disarmed and defeated, was hauled to his feet. His face was a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He was not killed by the legendary outlaw, but simply apprehended like a common criminal. For a man of his pride, it was a fate worse than death. As the marshals led him and his injured men away, Silas's eyes met Eli's one last time, filled with a hatred that would likely fester in a prison cell for the rest of his days. In the quiet aftermath, the barn felt like a desecrated church. The air was still thick with the smells of gunpowder and fear. Clara descended from the loft, her legs trembling. She and Eli stood in the center of the chaos, two survivors on a hard-won battlefield. No words were needed. The next morning brought a fragile, clean light. It also brought Abel Whitlow. He didn't ride up to the gate with anger or demands this time. He walked leading his horse, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He stopped before Clara, unable to meet her eyes. "He told you?" He said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Pike, he told you what I did at Red Mesa." Clara simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "I was a coward." Abel confessed, the words tearing from him, painful and raw. "I was drowning in debt, and Thomas Pike, he was a cruel man. I convinced myself it wasn't a betrayal, it was leveling the field. I never knew who the other man was, the gunman. I just ran." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, soul-deep shame. "I don't ask for your forgiveness, Clara. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to hear it from me." He turned to leave, not as a villain, but as a broken man seeking a path toward his own private atonement, a journey that would take him far from here. "Father," Clara said, her voice stopping him. He turned back. "Be a better man than the one you were yesterday." It was not forgiveness, but it was a release. Acknowledging the truth, she set both of them free from the lie. He nodded a single grateful gesture and walked away, disappearing down the long, dusty road. Weeks later, a new normal settled over the ranch. It was not the quiet of hiding, but the calm of building. The poisoned well was cleaned, the fences mended, the ghosts of Red Mesa laid to rest, not forgotten, but accepted. The nightmares still came for both of them, but they were fewer, their edges softened by the reality of the morning sun and the promise of a shared future. Eli had recovered the silver locket from the floor of the barn, its surface scratched but unbroken. He returned it to her one evening, placing it gently in her palm. It felt different in her hand now, heavier with the weight of all that had happened. The resolution between them was not one of grand romantic declarations, but of quiet mutual respect and a partnership forged in fire. It was in the way he started leaving the bird-sketching book open on the table for her to see, and in the way she began to call the ranch home without hesitation. One clear, cool afternoon, they stood together at the main gate, the one she had collapsed at so many weeks ago. It had been damaged in the final confrontation, one of its hinges torn loose. Armed with hammers and nails, they worked side by side, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of reconstruction. When the last nail was hammered home, the gate stood strong and true. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out her mother's locket. For a moment, she looked at the faded portraits inside, a link to the past that had both haunted and saved her. Then, with a soft cloth, she polished the silver until it shone a small bright star in the afternoon sun. Instead of tucking it away, she fastened the chain securely around her neck. It was no longer a relic of a life she had lost, but an emblem of the one she had claimed. She stood beside Eli, and together they looked not out at the endless, uncertain horizon, but at the gate they had rebuilt. It was no longer a barrier to escape through or a line to be defended. It was a threshold, the entrance to a life they were building together, grounded in the land they had fought to protect.